let's just take that last caller, and then I get to ask my questions after. We're going to have a really super short break, I hope. Grover, you're on.
Yes, thanks for having me on.
Hi, I hate to make it quick because I know that's almost impossible, but try.
Oh, there were two things I wanted to hit. But anyway, around the time of the plane crash, I was just wondering, and you were talking about, bully politics earlier. I was wondering if Representative Begich or Representative Boggs were championing or talking about certain issues that the establishment wanted left alone.
Yeah, there were. There were several issues. First of all, Dad wasn't corruptible, and they had a problem with that. And there were attempts to corrupt him during the Alaska pipeline debates, and it just didn't happen. And the other issue was Boggs' position was he wanted the FBI completely revamped. He was tired of congressional phone lines being tapped by the FBI under the Nixon administration. He also wanted to reopen the Warren Commission. He was a Warren commissioner. He did not believe the government was acting in a way that it should. The FBI was violating the civil liberties of not just the average American, but the entire Congress to protect J. Edgar Hoover. He eventually was gone. But the systemic problems with the FBI never did go away. In fact, just before 9/11, the month before 9/11, the Congress was revisiting the mess that the FBI had created in so many of the major cases. And then after 9/11, we gave them more authority, more money, and greater budgets. And it's the FBI telexes that we're going to be talking about after the break that'll bring a little bit more clarity to that whole issue.
That's right. It's the whole heck of a job, Brownie. You're doing a heck of a job, Brownie. Let's give you some more to do. That's exactly. So we're going to be talking about those telexes and the reasons that this plane was disappeared, quite possibly could not have been weather. We'll be talking to Dr. Nick Begich about that right after this break. So right before we went to the break, we were talking about the telex, which explained to us, first of all, where were you when you found out that your father's plane had disappeared with Hale Boggs, his aide, your father's legislative aide, and the pilot, Mr. Jones.
Right, and it was Russ Brown, and many people forget Russ Brown was my dad's aide who was lost on the plane, and his family's been in touch with us from time to time as well. We were all in Washington, D.C., just outside of Washington, D.C. We lived in McLean, Virginia, and we were all still in course school. I was a young kid then. 13 years old, and I remember my mom coming down. In fact, it was my brother who answered the phone, and it was, he was young, and he was like, hey, some governor's on the phone, and it was Bill Egan calling, and to let my mom know that the plane had been lost. She asked us all whether we wanted to go to school that day, and we all did. A plane going down in Alaska was not such an unusual thing. In fact, Dad's had been down before, and, for a few hours, and he'd come back up. But as the weeks went on, of course, it became obvious that that probably wasn't going to happen in this case. But there was never any finality. I mean, there were never any bodies recovered. Officially, no plane was ever recovered. It's the same kind of sensation, I'm sure, that goes through people that have family members that were, in those days, missing in action in Vietnam. And I had friends in school that had that experience, and so
or fishing accidents. I know that
exactly.
I grew up with people who never found their fathers, never found their brothers or husbands.
And you always wonder. I mean, Dad was an Eagle Scout. He had some capability. He was also a contractor, knew how to build things. So you always wondered. You never do get finality in this situation. And then it was in 1993 that Roll Call, the pretty prestigious publication in Washington, D.C., went out and started looking at congressional deaths. Starting in the early 70s. And the first two that they ran into were Hale Boggs and my dad. And what they found were these telexes. They got them through the Freedom of Information Act, which was passed in 1976, which was part of the legislation in the aftermath of Watergate. And people need to remember that when Dad was running, this was 3 weeks before the second election of Richard Nixon, and just a few weeks before the eventual release of what was going on with Watergate. And people need to remember that Hale Boggs was the majority leader in the House. He would have likely been the successor. In fact, he would have been the successor to the Speaker's position, which would have put him in line for the presidency. My belief is that and Boggs was aware of the Watergate and what was brewing. It just hadn't released yet, but he was sort of a point person, at least in the House. My expectation would have been that the election would have went down. I mean, McGovern didn't have a prayer. It wasn't going to happen that way. Nixon won his second election. But what would have likely happened, if people remember, it was Agnew that actually broke the tie in the U.S. Senate 50-50 on the Alaska pipeline. Many don't remember that. But it was only a few months later that he was thrown out of office for corruption. My belief is that probably Boggs would have been moved into that speaker's position a little more rapidly. Agnew and Nixon would have probably been booted at the same time, and that would have put Hale Boggs in the presidency of the United States, which would have changed everything about what happened. Because if people remember, it was Ford that got the appointment in the vice president slot. Then he moved into the presidency. He brought in Rockefeller as a vice president, which a lot of people with conspiratorial ideas found offense to that. But then he pardoned Richard Nixon. And by doing so, he denied the public the true access to the full extent of his corruption. And Nixon hated Hale Boggs. And it's in his records. In fact, the most recent tapes released have extensive sections about Nixon and his staff criticizing Boggs, because Boggs wasn't someone that was willing to lay down. He was someone that stood up for the American people and did it with a lot of vigor and a lot of energy. Unfortunately, he wasn't there to finish his job either, which I think if anyone was a target of this, it was him. The telexes that came in were from people that were apparently involved in government surveillance projects. These were civilian sector technicians. They went into the FBI. They said they had located the plane. They gave the coordinates and said 2 people were still living at the crash site. Later in that week, that was forwarded on to Washington. Later in that week, another telex came through that confirmed the authenticity of those revealing that information, although to this day, the government will not publicly release the names of those individuals who were involved in that disclosure. So part of it was we weren't supposed to have that technology in the early 1970s. And the fact is, we could read the date off of a dime at 30,000 feet in the early 70s. Unfortunately, that was a matter of national security, and I think that was part of the reason a lot of this information didn't come forward.